Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking on, well, a really fascinating challenge. We're diving deep into high-level vocabulary, specifically words related to revolution, reforms, and social movements. Our mission, it's really to help you navigate discussions about political change, social progress, civil movements, basically to do it with sophistication and accuracy. Think of this as your essential guide, maybe, to understanding the language of transformation. So what do you think is the first thing listeners really need to grasp about these kinds of terms?
Well, what's truly vital here, I think, is that mastering this specific vocabulary isn't just about, sounding intelligent. It's really about gaining precise tools for analytical thinking. The sources we looked at really highlight how these terms let us connect the dots between historical events and what's happening now. They help us grasp the nuances of how societies fundamentally change. It's key.
That makes total sense. It feels like getting the right lens for the job, doesn't it? So when we talk about these big, sometimes sudden shifts, where do we even begin? Let's kick off with the language of revolution, words and phrases describing powerful, often abrupt changes in power or society. First up, we have insurrection, defined as a violent uprising against a government or authority. For example, insurrection led to the collapse of the ruling regime. Our sources really emphasize it's a more formal term than riot. It's reserved for serious violent rebellion.
Right. And following that, we have uprising. Now, this is also an organized rebellion against power. An example might be the workers' uprising brought the city to a halt. You'll probably hear this word quite often in history documentaries, things like that, and maybe to draw a finer line. While both involve resistance, an insurrection often implies a more direct, maybe even armed attempt to overthrow a government, whereas an uprising can cover broader, large-scale civil unrest or protests. They significantly disrupt society, but don't necessarily aim for an immediate seizure of power right then.
Okay, that distinction is incredibly helpful. Good point. Then there's coup d'etat. That term always sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? Like you said, maybe a corporate takeover feel, but with military uniforms and, well, a lot more at stake. It means a sudden and illegal seizure of power, often by the military. So picture this. The military staged a coup d'etat and took control overnight. And here's a key insight from our sources. Unlike a full-scale revolution, which often wants to overturn the entire system, a coup frequently aims to seize power within the existing system, just replacing leadership, maybe leaving institutions mostly intact. Plus, its French origin gives it that sort of academic feel.
Exactly. And often the ultimate goal of these actions, whether they're swift, like a coup, or more drawn out, might be an overthrow, which is simply the act of removing a leader or government, as in the people united to overthrow the dictatorship. Pretty straightforward, that one.
Yeah, a powerful action, though. And we can't forget rebellion. That signifies open resistance to authority. The rebellion lasted for months before peace talks began. So this highlights a sustained period of opposition, often more prolonged than, say, an immediate insurrection.
And stepping back for a moment, just to understand the forces driving these events, we should probably consider radicalization. This describes the process of adopting extreme ideas or actions, like social isolation can lead to radicalization of youth. This concept is pretty crucial for understanding how individuals or groups might shift towards more extreme forms of protest or resistance.
Right, and often the ultimate aim, maybe of these movements or even external pressures, is regime change. That's simply the replacement of one government with another. You hear this a lot in international relations, right? Like Western powers call for regime change.
Absolutely. And looking at the broader context here, these words really help express different degrees of upheaval. They even help pinpoint the specific actors involved, from organized military actions like coups to much broader civil unrest. Having this precise vocabulary helps you articulate a more sophisticated understanding, especially when you're discussing critical, real-world questions like, should governments intervene in revolutions abroad? Or do protests actually lead to meaningful political change?
Okay, so we've unpacked the vocabulary of dramatic, often sudden upheaval. But what about change that's maybe slower? Less dramatic on the surface, perhaps, but still profoundly impactful. That brings us to the language of reforms. This feels like a completely different beast, focusing on improving systems from within rather than, tearing them down. First, maybe legislative reform, an example. Legislative reforms help reduce corruption in the public sector. Our sources indicate this is a perfect term for discussions on government, law, or political policy. Makes sense.
Building on that, institutional change is crucial. Institutional change is necessary for real progress in developing nations. This term is particularly good for discussing broader systemic improvements, like in education or healthcare. It highlights shifts in the underlying structures themselves.
Okay. And then we have socioeconomic reform. This focuses on changes that reduce social or economic disparities, like socioeconomic reforms reduce the income gap in the country. Then there's grassroots reform, which, like the name suggests, often begins with concerned citizens themselves. It bubbles up from the community level. Grassroots reform often begins with concerned citizens.
Right. And a powerful phrase that our sources use quite frequently is policy overhaul. For instance, the education system requires a complete policy overhaul. That word overhaul itself is a strong, high-level term. It indicates a deep, comprehensive change, not just some minor tweak. And finally, modernization. Modernization of transport systems is crucial for economic growth. This just implies bringing systems up to current standards, making them more effective for today.
So a question that often comes up is, how do you know which term to use? It can seem a bit tricky. When you're talking about change, I guess you always need to match your vocabulary to the level of transformation, right? For a small change, maybe you'd use adjustment or amendment. But for a big change, you'd reach for something like overhaul, transformation, or maybe even revolution if it's that fundamental.
Oh.
You also need to think about who caused the change. Was it grassroots or was it top-down government initiative?
Exactly. Understanding those distinctions allows for much more precise communication. It ensures your language reflects the true scope and the origin of the change you're describing. It adds clarity.
Okay, great. Now let's explore social movements. This is a very common theme when we discuss collective action, protest, activism. While you might already have a decent grasp of what civil disobedience means, our sources really highlighted its enduring power. It was central to Gandhi's movement, for example. It's about refusing to obey certain laws or demands of a government or an occupying power, but without resorting to violence. It's a deliberate, moral stand against injustice.
And then there's the grassroots movement, which we touched on with reform. As the example illustrates, the movement began as a grassroots campaign in rural areas. This implies it grew organically from the local community, often reflecting genuine local concerns and energy.
Right, and activism itself is maybe a broader term, taking action to bring about political or social change. Youth activism is rising due to climate concerns. That's a good example. Our sources highlighted how its forms are evolving too, extending beyond traditional protests into digital campaigns, consumer choices, all sorts of things. Closely related is advocacy, where someone supports or argues for a cause or policy, like he works in advocacy for refugees and asylum seekers.
Yeah, and mobilization refers to the act of organizing and bringing together resources or people for a cause. The movement relied on the rapid mobilization of supporters. This is really key to a movement's ability to exert pressure to make an impact. And resistance is open defiance or opposition. Cultural resistance is often seen through music and art, which shows that resistance isn't always overt political action. It can be subtle, too.
Good point. Finally, liberation. This term speaks to the act of setting someone or something free. Free from imprisonment, free from oppression. The war ended with the liberation of the oppressed group. It's a term that's definitely loaded with historical significance.
What's really striking here, I think, is how these terms, when you look at them across our sources, capture such diverse ways people come together. They illustrate the spectrum from individual acts of defiance, like civil disobedience, to these large-scale organized efforts to advocate for change or to resist existing structures. It really highlights the collective action at the heart of how societies evolve.
Now, this is where it really starts to click for me. We've defined the individual terms, which is great, but I've noticed they often appear together in very specific ways, these pairings. Expert, what happens when we start combining these words? Is there a particular power in those combinations?
Absolutely. The research really highlights that these individual words become even more impactful when they're combined into what we call powerful natural collocations and phrases. And these aren't just about sounding sophisticated, though they help with that. They convey very specific meanings that single words often can't quite capture. For instance, you don't just start a revolution, you often spark a revolution. As in, injustice sparked a revolution. It implies that initial ignition point.
That's a really powerful point about precision.
Yeah.
And instead of just saying, ask for reform, you can call for reform. The public called for urgent reform. This is more deliberate, maybe more organized demand. When things get tough, you might see an authoritarian crackdown, not just a violent response. A violent crackdown followed the protests. And that word authoritarian adds so much meaning, doesn't it? About the type of government involved.
It does. It paints a much clearer picture immediately. And when people gather, it's often described as the peaceful protest. They organized a peaceful protest in the capital. This emphasizes the nonviolent nature, which is often a key strategic choice. We also have phrases like fuel discontent. Rising prices fueled discontent among the people. It suggests something feeding the unhappiness.
Right. And regimes often try to suppress dissent. The regime tried to suppress dissent. This really conveys the act of actively quashing opposition, trying to shut down voices. A large-scale effort involves widespread mobilization. The campaign saw widespread mobilization of citizens, big scale. When something truly unfair happens, there's often public outcry. There was public outcry over the injustice, a strong collective reaction. And for significant policy shifts, governments might enact sweeping changes. The government enacted sweeping changes in policy. Sounds major. Finally, when things escalate, you might say civil unrest escalated. Unrest escalated after the military's involvement shows a worsening situation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the power of these collocations is immense. Our sources really show how they allow for a much more precise and sophisticated description of events and actions. You move beyond simple verbs to phrases that convey the specific dynamics, the relationships between different elements of political and social change. They truly give your language a richer, more nuanced texture.
Okay, now let's make this practical. Imagine you're discussing one of these topics. Let's try some practice. What if you were asked, do you think revolution is necessary for real change? How could you use this? Well, you could say something like, well, in some cases, history shows that peaceful protests and maybe even institutional reform are insufficient. And revolution becomes the only option when a regime refuses to engage with, say, public outcry. See how you can weave those terms in.
Exactly. Or consider this question, what are the pros and cons of social movements? Curious. You might respond, well, on the one hand, grassroots movements are invaluable for bringing public outcry to underrepresented issues, and they can fuel discontent with the status quo, often leading to widespread mobilization of citizens. Quote, however, a significant con perhaps is that without a clear structure or unified leadership, they can sometimes struggle to enact sweeping changes or achieve sustained legislative reform after that initial fervor, subsides.
And for writing, imagine an essay task like this. Some people believe that protests are ineffective in creating real social change. To what extent do you agree? In your argument, you could powerfully use terms like civil disobedience, authoritarian crackdown, grassroots movement, or legislative reform to build a really compelling case. The vocabulary, clearly, makes all the difference in conveying nuance and depth in your answer. So that pretty much wraps up today's deep dive. You've now learned, well, over 25 key vocabulary items related to revolution, reform, and social movements. Plus, we've looked at practical examples and real-world applications, all directly inspired by the material we've explored. So what does this all mean for you listening? Well, here's my tip. Review this list regularly. Really try to use these words in your speaking and writing practice. Make them active vocabulary, not just words you kind of recognize.
And perhaps a final thought, one question that often comes up is, why is all this precision so valuable? Well, having this precise vocabulary allows you to not just describe events, but to critically analyze the mechanisms of change and resistance in any society. It helps you recognize patterns that might transcend time and place. It encourages you, really, to consider how these terms reflect fundamental human efforts to shape the world around us, and perhaps even to anticipate future shifts. Food for thought.